Let's take a look at how we can manipulate an object, meaning move, rotate, and scale it by not using the transform panel on the right side. I could, for example, to move it, press G like grab, and then if I press G, you see that the object becomes white, and then I can move my mouse around, and yeah, basically my object follows it. And you see it also doesn't really matter where my mouse is. If I press G, it's just the object just moves based on my mouse movement in relationship to where the object was before. And you can see I'm in the front view, so I can move my object along the Z and the Y axis. Let's say I press 3, so I'm now in the right view. And if I press G, now I can move it up and down and along the Y axis. And if I'm in top view, I can only move it along the Y and X axis. You also see that inside the transformation property panel, the values are being updated. And also on the lower left corner, you will see that D, Y, and Z values being updated as well. I could, for example, press G. Now let's say I would like to move it only along the X-axis. Then I could, for example, press X. And now you see that the X-axis is actually highlighted. And now I can move my mouse left and right. I can actually move it up and down. But you see that my object is restricted to the X-axis. And maybe now I could type in 2. And then you see that it was moved by 2 units. And because I started from x0, moving it along the x-axis by 2 units, it of course ends at x1. Now if I press G again and X and 1, I added another unit. Now it's at x3. So let's move this one back to 0. So I could, for example, press X and then Z, and then I only can move it up. If I press 1, I move it 1 unit upwards. If I press G, 0, and -1, I move it downwards 1 unit. To rotate an object, I can press R, and then you see based on where my mouse is, a dotted line happens. The closer I get to my object, the more responsive the rotation is, and the further I move my mouse away from the object, the finer I have control over the rotation value. And here as well, inside the rotation panel, you see the values being updated, the same in rotation. For example, I could type in 45 degree, and then my object is being rotated 45 degree along the y-axis, because currently I only see Z and X, and that is my view axis, and of course that means it's being rotated along this axis in case you're in orthographic view. So let's say you're actually in a perspective view and you would like to only rotate your object along the y-axis by, let's say, 45 degree. Well, I could go in here and type in 45 degree. However, I could also, in any view, press R and then press Y for restricting it to the y-axis, and type in -45 degree to just rotate it back. So let's do this again. Z, for example, this time for rotate 45 degree, or R and Z -45 degree. You see? The pressing X, Y, and Z is a very, very easy way to restrict your movements or rotation. And the same is also true for scale. So if you press S, you can scale an object, and it scales automatically along X, Y, and Z. And here Next to my mouse, you see the scale values being interactively updated. The same like down here, scale X, Y, and Z. So let's say I would like this cube to be twice as tall than it is wide. So that means I would have to press Z for scaling only along the Z-axis. And I would like to double the size. So currently I have a scale of 1 for X, Y, and Z. To get to 2, I have to double this. So I press 2. And then you see that 1 multiplied by 2 results in 2. If I press scale Z and 2 again, I will end up at 4. If I would like to half that, so let's say I would like now to go back to Z being 2, I could either type in the number or press scale S, Z, and then 0.5, because 0.5 is like half, 50%. So you see now I'm back to 2. If, for example, I press S, Z, and then 0.25, I am scaling down to 1/4 of that size, which now is 0.5. And regarding the axis constraints, you see which are very, very useful. I could, for example, also say, well, scale along the X and Y axis, but not the Z axis, by simply pressing now Shift Z. So you see, if I press Shift Z, X and Y is being highlighted. If I press Shift Y, X and Z is highlighted. And if I press 2 now, with Shift Z, excluding the Z axis, I scale along the X and the Y axis by unit of 2. So that's, for example, one way how you could quickly move or scale and rotate your objects, and then also use the axis restrictions. There is now a third way, and you see that currently I have kind of like a blue arrow or red or green arrow, and that's the 3D widget. And the icons for this one you have down here. The first one is to turn the 3D widget on off. I have, for example, here a widget for rotation. Or, for example, for scale. And let's set this one back to 2 for X, Y, and 1 for Z. And then the rotation at 0. So you see that the arrow is for move, then the arc is for rotate, and this cube is for the scale, because this is similar to the global and rotate tool in Alias, and this icon you only see in Alias when, for example, you switch to the local mode. Blender has the same like Alias for global and local. So for example, right now I have the ability to move my object up and down. Let's say I switch to rotate, click on my X-axis rotation. You see at the same time it is being restricted to the X-axis. And you see lower left corner, I'm right now at -43. So let's say I type in -45, press enter. So you see, while roughly guessing the rotation I need and still having my left mouse button pressed, I can still enter values and, for example, then with pressing return, enter that value. And if I now switch to the move 3D widget, you see that my 3D widget is actually rotated by 45 degrees. And if I click on this arrow, you see that my object is being now moved along the local z-axis. It's going to a side view, and there you see how it's moving along the local z-axis. The same is true for scaling. For example, right now, I can scale locally along the z-axis. So this is, for example, really useful if you have an object that has to be at an angle and you don't necessarily know where to position it correctly. You could rotate it and then, for example, experiment with the size or rotation. Now let's say you are in global mode and you would like to move this object along the z-axis, but the local one, but you don't always want to switch between local and global and then click on the different icons. That might be a little bit cumbersome, like for example it is in Alias. Well, what we could do is we press G for move, and then we press Z for constraining it to the z-axis. And the first time you press an axis icon, Z, Y, or X, it is global. And then when I press Z a second time, you see that now I'm using the local space. Same, for example, for S and Z. I can scale along the z-axis, global space, or z-axis, local space. And then again, keep in mind, because you're in object mode, all those values can be just overwritten afterwards, so there's no problem in playing around the size, scale, and position of objects. That's all interactively changeable afterwards.